All she wanted was a decent job, a little peace and, if possible, a boss she could actually tolerate. Instead, she ended up in an isolated mansion, standing face to face with a wealthy widower who looked dangerously handsome and had the personality of a storm. His proposal was outrageous. Her answer should have been no. But sometimes the biggest mess of your life begins the exact moment you decide to stay. The box wasn't heavy. That was the worst part. Ava Anderson carried 6 years of work in a single cardboard box. A chipped mug, a framed photo of her and Sophie from college, a half-dead succulent she'd named Gerald, and a notebook full of ideas that no longer belonged to her. 6 years at Whitmore and Lane, and this was all she had to show for it. She stood on the sidewalk outside the glass building in Manchester, rain spotting the cardboard, and felt something dangerous rising in her chest. Not sadness, anger. The kind that burned clean and steady, like a pilot light that wouldn't go out. Kevin Price had stolen her project. The sustainability proposal she'd spent 4 months building, the one she'd been foolish enough to share with a colleague she thought was a friend. He'd presented it on Monday with his name on the cover. By Wednesday he had her promotion. By Friday she had the box. Her flat in Salford was small enough that she could stand in the kitchen and touch the bathroom door. Gerald got the last spot on the windowsill, next to unopened bills she'd been pretending didn't exist. 3 days passed. She applied to 14 jobs, refreshing her inbox every 20 minutes. 2 automated rejections. 12 silences. Her savings had enough for 6 weeks of rent. Maybe 7 if she stopped eating anything that required cooking. On the 4th morning, she bought a newspaper because the Wi-Fi was down again. She spread it on the kitchen table, circling listings with a red pen running out of ink. Most were rubbish. Part-time retail, weekend shifts, suspicious marketing opportunities that smelled like pyramid schemes. Then she saw it. Bottom of page 9, tucked between an ad for garden furniture and a notice about a missing cat. Small print, no logo, no company name. Position available. Generous compensation. Transport and accommodation provided. Discretion required. Send CV to the address below. No job title, no description, no location beyond a P.O. box. She should have turned the page. Instead, she tore it out and tucked it into her back pocket. That evening, she sent her CV and hit send before the reasonable part of her brain could object. If this story is touching your heart, show your support. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. Every action helps us keep bringing you new stories full of emotion. 4 days of silence. She'd almost forgotten about it when her phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon. The voice on the other end was female, polished, and efficient. Ava had been selected. She was to present herself at an address in the Cotswolds the following Monday. A car would collect her from the train station in Moreton-in-Marsh. "What exactly is the position?" Ava asked. A brief pause. "That will be explained upon arrival." The line went dead. Every sensible instinct told her to delete the number and move on. But Sensible hadn't paid rent this month. Sensible hadn't stopped Kevin Price from walking away with her career. Sensible was a luxury she could no longer afford. She called Sophie that night. "Absolutely not," Sophie said before Ava had even finished. "This is how horror films start. A mysterious job in the middle of nowhere, you'll end up in a ditch." "It's the Cotswolds, Soph. The worst thing there is overpriced cheese. You don't even know what the job is. I know it pays well and includes a roof over my head. Right now, that's enough." Sophie went quiet. When she spoke again, her voice had softened. "You're really doing this, aren't you?" "I don't have a better option. Text me every day. If I don't hear from you by 9, I'm calling the police and every true crime podcast in the country." Monday came cold and bright. Ava packed her life into a suitcase with a broken wheel and a zipper that required negotiation. She boarded the train at Piccadilly, watched the city give way to green fields, and told herself, repeatedly, that this was a practical decision. The car was waiting at the station, a black sedan, polished and silent. The driver opened the door without a word. They wound through narrow lanes bordered by stone walls and hedgerows heavy with rain. When the car turned through a set of iron gates and the house came into view, Ava's stomach dropped. It wasn't a house. It was a manor. Pale stone, tall windows, ivy climbing the east wall. Gardens stretched in every direction, trimmed, deliberate, impossibly green. A gravel drive curved toward a front door that looked like it belonged in a period drama. The car stopped. The driver opened her door. Ava stepped out, suitcase scraping the gravel. The front door opened. The man standing there was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark eyes and a jaw that looked like it had been carved on purpose. His sleeves were rolled to the elbows, and his expression carried the warmth of a tax audit. He looked her over, slow, deliberate, head to toe, like he was reading a report and finding it lacking. "I expected someone older," he said. Ava straightened her spine, lifted her chin. "And I expected someone friendlier." The silence between them could have cut glass. Then, from behind his legs, two small faces appeared, identical, 6 years old maybe. Dark hair, curious eyes, matching grins. One of them tugged at his father's shirt and whispered, loud enough for all of England to hear, "Dad, she's pretty. Do you think she'll stay?" The smell hit her first. Old wood, leather, and coffee so strong it could wake the dead. The entrance hall was wide and tall, with stone floors that echoed under her shoes, and a staircase that swept upward like something out of a novel. Ava's suitcase suddenly felt very small. "This way," the man said, already walking. She followed. Not because he told her to, but because standing alone in that hall felt worse. The two boys trailed behind her like a pair of curious foxes. She could feel their eyes on her back. One of them whispered something to the other, and both giggled. The sitting room had dark shelves stacked with books, an unlit fireplace, and two leather armchairs facing each other like opposing sides in a negotiation. He gestured to one. She sat. He remained standing for a moment before sitting across from her. A woman appeared in the doorway, grey hair pinned back, apron tied with military precision. She set coffee on the table without a word and left. Her eyes swept over Ava with quiet judgment that needed no translation. "Mrs. Finch," he said, as if that explained everything. He poured coffee for both of them. Ava noticed his hands were steady, deliberate, the kind of hands that didn't fumble. "I'm Tristan Oakley," he said, "and I assume you have questions about what you're doing here." "Several." She picked up the cup. The coffee was excellent, which annoyed her. He didn't ease into it. No small talk, no build-up. "I need someone to pretend to be my fiancé." Ava choked. Coffee went the wrong way. She coughed, set the cup down and stared at him. He continued as if she hadn't just nearly died on his armchair. His wife had passed 3 years ago. Her parents, the boy's maternal grandparents, had filed for custody. They claimed he couldn't provide a stable home alone. A partner, even an engaged one, would shift the picture in his favor. "Why not find someone real?" she asked, her voice still raw from the coughing. "I don't want someone real." The way he said it closed a door. She could hear the lock click. He'd had her background checked. She knew that now. No family, no ties, no one who would ask difficult questions. He'd chosen her like he'd choose a contractor, best fit for the scope of work. Ava set her jaw. She stood up so fast the chair scraped against the floor. "This is insane," she said. "You're out of your mind. You put an ad in a newspaper, dragged me across the country, sat me down in your fancy room with your fancy coffee, and you're asking me to... what? Play house?" He didn't flinch. Just watched her with those dark eyes, calm, unmoved, like a man who'd already calculated every possible reaction and filed them alphabetically. "The compensation is substantial," he said. "I don't care." "You should. You've been unemployed for 3 weeks, your rent is overdue, and your savings won't last past next month." The accuracy of that hit her like cold water. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out. She turned toward the door, grabbed her bag from the floor, took 4 steps, and then she made the mistake of looking back. Tristan hadn't moved. His face was the same, controlled, guarded, giving nothing away. But behind him, in the doorway, stood the twins. 2 small boys with wide brown eyes and bare feet on the cold floor. One of them held a stuffed elephant missing an ear. The other had his hands in his pockets, mimicking his father without knowing it. They looked at her the way children look at something they want to keep. Something inside her cracked, not broke, cracked, the way a wall cracks when the roots behind it have been pushing for years. She turned back, sat down, crossed her arms. "I want the rules in writing." Something shifted in his face. Not a smile, not relief, just the smallest loosening of a tension she hadn't realized he was carrying. The rules were simple. Separate bedrooms side by side. No physical intimacy. A fixed term, until the custody case was resolved. In exchange, she would receive a generous monthly salary and full room and board. She would attend events with him as his fiancée. She would interact with the boys as a natural part of the household. "And when it's over?" she asked. "You leave. Clean break. No obligations." She held his gaze for a long moment. His eyes were dark brown, almost black in this light, and far too steady for comfort. "Fine," she said. He extended his hand across the table. She took it. His grip was warm, firm, and the skin of his palm was rougher than she expected from a man who lived in a manor. The handshake lasted 1 second too long. Neither of them mentioned it. Upstairs, Mrs. Finch showed her to a room with cream walls, a wide bed, and a window overlooking the garden. The room smelled like fresh linen and lavender. Next door, his door, was closed. Ava sat on the edge of the bed, suitcase still zipped at her feet, and pressed her hands against her face. What had she just agreed to? Down the hall she heard the twins laughing, and somewhere beneath the panic and the disbelief, and the unmistakable scent of lavender, a thought she refused to name settled quietly in her chest. The first shoe disappeared on a Wednesday. Ava woke up, swung her legs out of bed, and found only one ballet flat where she'd left two. She checked under the bed behind the curtain inside the wardrobe. Nothing. She walked to breakfast with one shoe on and one sock sliding on the cold stone floor. The twins were already at the kitchen table, eating toast with exaggerated innocence. Oliver, the one with the cowlick that refused to lie flat, kept his eyes on his plate. Ethan, whose front tooth was missing and whose grin was therefore impossible to take seriously, glanced at her feet and bit his lip. Mrs. Finch stood at the counter, drying a mug with slow, circular precision. She said nothing, but the corner of her mouth twitched. Tristan walked in, coffee in hand, and stopped when he saw her mismatched feet. "Problem?" he asked. "Not at all," Ava said brightly. "I've decided one shoe is the new fashion." She sat down, poured herself tea, and didn't mention the shoe again. Under the table, she caught Ethan nudging Oliver with his elbow. By Thursday, the shoe had been joined by her hairbrush. By Friday, the salt in her orange juice made her eyes water mid-sip. She swallowed it without flinching, looked at the twins across the table and said, "Bit tangy today." She could have complained, could have gone to Tristan and told him his children were waging a small, calculated war against her comfort. But Ava had grown up in care homes where much worse had been done with much less creativity. These boys weren't mean. They were testing. And she understood testing. She'd done plenty of it herself when she was small and scared, and needed to know if the new person would stay or leave. So she fought back, but not the way they expected. Saturday morning, she set up a competition in the garden. The rules were simple. Whoever could tell the most ridiculous story in 2 minutes won the right to choose the film that evening. Oliver went first, spinning a wild tale about a dragon who was afraid of butterflies. Ethan followed with a story about a fish who drove a taxi. Ava went last, and her story involved a penguin who became Prime Minister and banned homework forever. The boys voted for her unanimously. She bowed. That night, all three of them squeezed onto the sofa in the living room. Oliver sat on her left, Ethan on her right, and they argued over the remote with the passion of tiny lawyers. She let them win. The film was about a talking dog, and it was terrible, and Ava laughed more than she had in months. From the hallway, Tristan watched. He stood just past the doorframe, one shoulder against the wall, coffee cooling in his hand. The light from the television flickered across the three of them, his boys tucked against a woman they'd known for less than 2 weeks. Comfortable, easy, as if she'd always been there. His chest tightened. He turned away before anyone saw him. The following week, Ava discovered that Ethan loved shepherd's pie, and Oliver would trade his soul for chocolate pudding. She started cooking dinner 3 nights a week, taking over a corner of the kitchen that Mrs. Finch guarded like a border patrol. The first time, Mrs. Finch stood behind her with crossed arms and watched every move. The second time, she handed Ava a better knife without being asked. By the third, she left the kitchen entirely, though Ava suspected she was listening from the hallway. Tristan noticed. He noticed everything, though he'd never admit it. He noticed that she learned Oliver's name for his stuffed elephant, Professor Trunk, and used it without being corrected. He noticed she braided a friendship bracelet for Ethan out of kitchen twine because he'd seen one on television and wanted his own. He noticed that she sang off-key while washing dishes, and that both boys had started singing along, equally off-key, and that the kitchen now sounded different in the evenings. What he didn't notice, or refused to, was the way his own routines had shifted. He came downstairs earlier, lingered at breakfast longer, found reasons to pass through the living room, when he heard her voice reading bedtime stories, doing different accents for every character, getting the French one so wrong that the boys screamed with laughter. One evening, after the boys had gone to bed, he found her in the sitting room with a mug of tea and a book she'd pulled from his shelf. "You're settling in," he said from the doorway. It wasn't a question. She looked up. The lamplight caught the curve of her cheek, and he looked away half a second too fast. "Your boys are wonderful," she said. "Terrible, but wonderful. They get it from me." The terrible part, I assume. He almost smiled. Almost. The muscle in his jaw moved, and then it was gone. "Good night, Ava. Good night, Tristan." He walked down the hall to his room and closed the door quietly. On the other side of the wall, she set down the book and pressed her palm flat against her chest, feeling her own heartbeat, fast and stubborn and completely uncalled for. In less than 2 weeks, she'd gone from stranger to something unnamed. The boys had let her in without hesitation, with the terrifying trust that only children have. Tristan hadn't let her in at all, but she'd caught him watching, twice now. And each time he'd looked away like a man pulling his hand back from a flame. 2:14 in the morning. The manor was silent in that heavy countryside way. No sirens, no traffic, just the occasional creak of old wood settling into itself. Ava lay in bed staring at the ceiling, throat dry, mind restless. She'd been dreaming about something she couldn't quite hold on to, and now sleep was done with her. Water. That was all she needed. She slipped out of bed in the silk nightgown Sophie had given her last birthday. Champagne-colored, thin straps, the kind of thing she never would have bought herself. She hadn't packed anything practical for sleeping, because she hadn't expected to be sleeping in a manor owned by a man who looked at her like she was a spreadsheet with errors. The hallway was dark. A faint glow came from somewhere downstairs, maybe the kitchen light left on by Mrs. Finch. The stone floor was cold under her bare feet. She moved quietly, one hand brushing the wall. She turned the corner. He was right there. Tristan, coming from the opposite direction, fresh from a shower. His hair was damp, pushed back from his forehead. He wore grey sweatpants that sat low on his hips and nothing else. His chest was broad, still faintly flushed from the hot water, and the hallway smelled like soap and something warmer underneath. Skin, heat, him. They both stopped, 2 feet apart. Ava's brain gave a clear and simple instruction. Look at his face. Her eyes did not obey. They dropped, collarbone, chest, the line down the center of his stomach, before she dragged them back up with the effort of someone lifting furniture. He noticed. Of course he noticed. His gaze moved over her slowly, from the bare shoulders to the silk that caught the faint light, to her bare feet on the cold floor. The corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, something more dangerous. The hallway felt smaller. "Good night," she said. The word came out like it had been pushed through a keyhole. She turned and walked to the kitchen with a composure she absolutely did not feel. Behind her she heard him exhale, one short breath, almost a laugh, and then his door clicked shut. In the kitchen she poured water with shaking hands, drank it in 3 gulps, set the glass down and gripped the edge of the counter. Her face was burning. She went back to bed. She did not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes she saw the line of his shoulders in the dark, the way the sweatpants hung, the almost smile. Her pillow smelled like lavender, and her thoughts smelled like trouble. At 7 the next morning, she locked her bedroom door, sat cross-legged on the bed, and called Sophie. "It's early," Sophie groaned. "Someone better be on fire." I need to talk to you. Ava kept her voice low. The walls in this house felt like they had ears. Are you whispering? Why are you whispering? Because I'm in his house and I don't want anyone to hear. Sophie was suddenly very awake. What happened? Ava told her. The corridor, the shower, the sweatpants, the complete and total failure of her eyes to stay above his neck. Sophie's laughter was loud enough that Ava pulled the phone away from her ear. Stop laughing. I can't. You just described this man like a dessert menu. Is he really that good-looking? Ava paused. She thought about his jaw, his hands, the way he filled a doorway. It's worse than that, she said. He's attractive in a way that makes me angry. Oh, sweetheart. Don't say it. You're attracted to him. I'm not. You described his stomach, Ava. You noticed the line down the middle. That's not observation, that's interest. It was dark. There was nothing else to look at. There was a wall. There was a floor. You chose the stomach. Ava fell back against the pillows and pressed her free hand over her eyes. Through the wall she could hear movement in his room, a drawer opening, footsteps, the ordinary sounds of a morning routine that now felt loaded with meaning. This is a job, she said firmly. A weird, insane, ridiculous job, but a job. He's paying me to pretend. That's it. Sophie let the silence stretch. Ava could practically hear her smiling. When you start denying things 3 times in a row, Sophie said, it means it's already too late. I've known you since you were 19, and you only repeat yourself when you're lying to yourself. I'm not lying. That's 4 times now. I hate you. You love me, and you're in trouble. Call me tomorrow. Ava hung up. She lay still for a long moment, listening to the house wake around her. Birdsong through the window. The twins' footsteps, fast and uneven, heading downstairs. Mrs. Finch's kettle whistling in the kitchen. She got dressed, checked her reflection in the mirror, normal, fine, totally composed, and went downstairs. Tristan was already at the breakfast table, dressed now, reading something on his phone. He didn't look up when she walked in, but his hand paused on his coffee cup for 1 beat too long. Morning, she said. Morning. His voice was even, controlled, as if last night hadn't happened. She poured her tea and sat across from him. Oliver climbed into the chair beside her and started telling her about a dream involving a spaceship made of cheese. She listened, laughed, responded, all while aware in every nerve of the man across the table who was pretending, with extraordinary discipline, not to look at her. He failed once, just once. When she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and her fingers brushed the strap of her top. His eyes followed the movement, then returned to his phone. Neither of them said a word about the corridor. Tristan Oakley had not become a successful man by losing focus. He'd built Oakley & Hale Construction from a 2-person office into one of the most respected firms in the Cotswolds through discipline, precision, and an almost mechanical ability to compartmentalize. Feelings went in one drawer, work went in another. The drawers never mixed, until a Tuesday morning when both drawers caught fire at the same time. He'd come downstairs early, planning to grab his laptop from the sitting room before heading to the office. The house was quiet. The boys were still asleep. Mrs. Finch hadn't started the kettle yet. The sitting room door was open. Ava was on a yoga mat in the center of the room doing Pilates. She wore dark leggings and a fitted top that stopped just above her waist. Her body was stretched long, one leg extended behind her, arms reaching forward, every line of her taut and controlled. Morning light came through the tall windows and caught the curve of her spine, the muscles in her shoulders, the strip of skin between the hem of her top and the waistband of her leggings. He stopped in the doorway. He should have turned around. He should have walked to the kitchen, poured coffee, reviewed the Henderson project specs. He should have done anything other than stand there like a man who'd forgotten how doors worked. She shifted into a new position. On her back now, knees bent, hips lifting in a slow bridge. Her eyes were closed. She hadn't seen him. His mouth went dry. He left. Walked to his office, closed the door with more force than necessary, and sat behind his desk. The Henderson specs were open on his screen. He read the same paragraph 4 times without absorbing a single word. The image of her stayed, not like a photograph, but like a burn. The arch of her back, the concentration on her face. The way she moved like she was completely unaware of what she looked like, which somehow made it worse. He pressed his palms flat against the desk and exhaled through his teeth. This was a contract. She was a solution to a legal problem. Nothing more. By 11 o'clock, James Hale walked into Tristan's office without knocking, which was his preferred method of entry and had been since university. James was tall, sandy-haired, and possessed the kind of easy charm that made clients trust him and made Tristan's jaw tighten at least twice a day. "Morning," James said, dropping into the chair across from the desk. "You look like you slept under a bridge." "I slept fine." "You're grinding your teeth. You only do that when something's off." James tilted his head. "What happened? Problems with the boys?" "The boys are fine." Tristan kept his eyes on the screen. "They're great, actually. She's been good with them." James leaned back. A slow, knowing grin spread across his face like sunrise over a bad idea. "She," he repeated. "The pretend fiancée." "Don't start." "You brought her up. I asked about the boys. You mentioned her." Tristan closed the laptop, rubbed the back of his neck. The office was quiet, just the hum of the computer and the distant sound of a lorry on the road outside. "The situation at the house," he said carefully, "is getting complicated." James raised an eyebrow. "Complicated how?" Silence. "Tristan. She does Pilates in the sitting room." James blinked. Then he laughed, a sharp, delighted bark that bounced off the office walls. "This isn't funny. It's the funniest thing you've ever said to me, and you once told a client his extension looked like a shipping container." Tristan stood up, walked to the window, and stared at the car park like it held answers. His reflection stared back, jaw clenched, shoulders rigid, the posture of a man trying to hold something in place that was already shifting. "She was supposed to be simple," he said, more to the glass than to James. "Show up, play the part, leave when it's done." And instead, my kids are fighting over who sits next to her at dinner. My house smells like shepherd's pie, and I can't walk into my own sitting room without—" He stopped. James waited, patient for once. "Without what?" Tristan turned from the window. His face was controlled, but his eyes gave him away, something restless underneath, something he hadn't planned for. "She's supposed to be pretend, James." "Right. And what's the problem with that?" "The problem is that nothing about her feels pretend." The words hung in the air between them. James let them sit for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I don't know," he said, standing and straightening his jacket. "Of all the things you've planned in your life, and you plan everything, down to what socks you wear on Tuesdays, this is the first one that's gone completely off the rails. That's not helpful. I'm your business partner, not your therapist." James moved toward the door, then paused. He turned back with the grin still in place, wider now. "For the record, I'm going to be the best man. I've already started looking at suits. Get out." "Navy or charcoal? I'm leaning navy." "Out." James left laughing. The door clicked shut behind him. Tristan sat back down, opened the laptop, stared at the Henderson specs. He thought about the arch of her back in the morning light, the way she laughed with his sons, the way she'd said goodnight in the corridor, breathless, her skin catching the dim light. He closed the laptop again. For the first time in years, Tristan Oakley had no plan. And the absence of one terrified him more than any courtroom ever could. Sunday smelled like butter and maple syrup. Ava followed the noise downstairs, the twins' laughter, the clatter of a spatula, something sizzling. She expected Mrs. Finch at the stove. What she found was Tristan. He stood at the kitchen island flipping pancakes with the focus of a man diffusing a device. He wore grey sweatpants and a dark apron tied at the waist, no shirt underneath. The apron hung open at the sides, showing the line of his ribs and the muscles that moved under his skin each time he reached for the batter. Ethan was perched on a stool, clapping every time a pancake landed. Oliver stood beside his father, holding a plate with both hands like it was a sacred duty. Ava walked in, aimed straight for the coffee pot, and poured with the concentration of a surgeon. "Do not look below his neck. Do not look below his neck." She looked. The apron strings were tied in a crooked bow at the small of his back. His shoulders were broader without a shirt, and there was a freckle just above his left shoulder blade she hadn't noticed before. Not that she should be cataloguing his freckles. "Coffee's fresh," Tristan said without turning around. "Great." Her voice came out an octave higher than intended. She cleared her throat. "Thanks." Oliver tugged her sleeve. "Dad's making the ones shaped like animals. Mine's a bear. Ethan's is a blob." "It's a whale," Ethan protested. "Looks like a blob." Ava sat at the table, wrapping both hands around the mug for something to hold. Tristan set a plate in front of her, 3 golden pancakes, perfectly round, with a small pot of syrup on the side. His arm reached past her shoulder. She caught the warmth of his skin and the faint, clean scent of soap. "Thank you," she said to the pancakes. He paused, just a beat, then moved back to the stove. The twins ate noisily. Ava ate carefully, and somewhere between the second pancake and the third, she accepted a quiet truth. She was in very serious trouble. The following Saturday brought a different kind of trouble entirely. Tristan told her on Wednesday. His friend Marcus was turning 40. There would be a party at a country house outside Stow-on-the-Wold. They would attend together, as a couple. "What should I wear?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "Whatever you'd normally wear." "I live out of a suitcase with a broken zipper, Tristan. My formal options are limited." He looked at her for a moment. The next morning, a garment bag appeared on her bed. Inside was a dress, deep green, simple cut, elegant without being showy. No note. She wore it Saturday evening with heels she'd borrowed from a box she found in the hallway closet. Mrs. Finch's, improbably. When she came downstairs, Tristan was waiting by the front door in a dark suit. He turned and his gaze moved over her once, slowly, like someone reading a sentence they wanted to memorize. He said nothing. His hand found the small of her back as they walked to the car. His fingers pressed lightly against the fabric, and the heat of his palm seeped through to her skin. Neither mentioned it. Both felt it. The party was warm and loud. String lights hung across a stone terrace. Music drifted from inside. The guests were polished and comfortable in the way people are when they've never had to worry about rent. Tristan introduced her to everyone as his fiancée. His hand never left her waist. His voice, each time he said the word, carried a weight that sounded less like performance and more like something he was trying out for real. The trouble started at the bar. A woman in a black dress, tall, red-lipped, confidence like armor, approached Tristan while Ava was getting a drink. She touched his arm and leaned in close. Her laugh was musical and deliberate. She spoke to him as though Ava were wallpaper. Then another, a blonde this time, standing too close, complimenting his suit with a hand that lingered on his lapel. Ava watched from 3 meters away, glass in hand, something hot and tight coiling in her chest. She had no right to feel this. It wasn't real. He wasn't hers. But her knuckles were white around the glass. Tristan didn't smile at the women, didn't lean in. When the blonde touched his lapel, he stepped back with a politeness so cold it could have frosted the champagne. He crossed the terrace, found Ava, and slid his hand around her waist again. Firm, deliberate, anchoring. "There you are," he said. And the way he looked at her made every woman on that terrace disappear. The ride home was quiet. Rain tapped the windshield. Tristan drove. Ava sat in the passenger seat, arms folded, staring out the window. "You're quiet," he said. "I'm fine." Too fast, she knew it. He knew it. He glanced at her. The headlights of a passing car swept across his face, catching something that might have been amusement or might have been something softer. He didn't push. He turned his eyes back to the road, but his hand moved from the gear lever to the space between them, open, palm up, resting on the center console. She stared at it for a long moment. The rain fell harder. The wipers kept their steady rhythm. She didn't take his hand. Not yet. But she didn't look away either. The afternoon had no business being that perfect. Ava sat on the veranda with a book she'd been pretending to read for the last 20 minutes. The words blurred together on the page because the scene in front of her kept pulling her eyes away, and she kept letting it. Tristan was in the garden with the boys. He'd taken off his shoes. That alone would have surprised her a month ago. The man who ironed his weekend shirts, who lined his coffee mugs by size, who scheduled his own breathing probably, was barefoot on the grass, chasing 2 6-year-olds who shrieked like small, joyful sirens. Oliver ran in zigzags, arms pumping, certain he was the fastest human alive. Tristan let him believe it, staying 2 steps behind with a grin that transformed his entire face. Not the controlled, careful expression she saw at breakfast. Not the guarded look he gave her when he thought she was studying him. This was something else entirely. Open, loose, almost boyish. The lines around his eyes deepened when he smiled like that, and the sight of it did something to her chest that she wasn't prepared to name. Ethan, smaller and more cunning, had taken a different approach. He'd circled behind his father and launched himself at Tristan's legs, wrapping both arms around one calf. Tristan stumbled dramatically, scooped him up with one arm and tossed him into the air. The sound Ethan made, that wild, breathless laugh, carried across the garden and settled somewhere deep inside Ava like a stone dropped into still water. Tristan caught him, held him against his chest and pressed a kiss to the top of his head. Quick, automatic. The gesture of a man who did this 100 times a day and never thought twice about it. Ava closed the book. Something was pressing behind her ribs. Not pain, exactly. Something older than pain, something that had lived in her for as long as she could remember but rarely surfaced. Only in moments like this, when she saw the thing she'd always wanted laid out in front of her like a photograph someone else had taken. A family, a real one, with grass stains on the knees and laughter that didn't need permission. With a father who tossed his children in the air and caught them like it was the easiest thing in the world. She'd never had that. Not once. The care homes had been clean, mostly. The foster families had been functional, mostly. But no one had ever chased her across a garden just to hear her laugh. No one had held her like catching her was the only thing that mattered. And the worst part, the part that made her throat ache, was that this wasn't hers either. This beautiful, messy, sunlit afternoon was borrowed. She was a hired guest in someone else's life, and when the contract ended, she would pack her broken suitcase and leave. The boys would ask where she went, and eventually they'd stop asking. Tristan would find someone real, someone with a family and a past that didn't need inventing, someone who belonged. She pressed her fingers against the bridge of her nose and breathed slowly. Out in the garden, Oliver had climbed onto Tristan's back and was declaring himself king of the mountain. Ethan was pulling his father's arm, demanding a turn. Tristan dropped to his knees in surrender, both boys piling on top of him, and for a moment, the 3 of them were just a heap of limbs and laughter on the green grass. Ava stood up, left the book on the chair, and went inside. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in years, not since the last foster home, the one where the woman told her she was a lovely girl, but they simply didn't have the room anymore. She'd been 14. She'd learned that day that crying didn't change the outcome. So she stopped. But the pressure behind her eyes stayed with her through the afternoon, through dinner, through the boys' bedtime stories. She read to them that night. Oliver chose a book about pirates, Ethan wanted dragons, and when she did the voices they laughed so hard Oliver got hiccups. She tucked them in, turned off the lamp, and stood in the dark hallway outside their room for a long minute, listening to them settle. She loved them. The realization arrived without ceremony, without drama. Just a quiet fact, like knowing her own name. She loved 2 little boys who weren't hers, and a life that had an expiration date written into a contract she'd signed, sitting in a leather chair. Downstairs the house was still. She made tea she didn't really want, and sat in the sitting room, staring at the cold fireplace. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily. Outside, the last light was fading behind the hills. "You're different tonight." Tristan's voice came from the doorway. She hadn't heard him approach. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed, watching her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Concern, maybe, threaded through with something careful and quiet. "I'm fine," she said. The words were automatic, and they both knew it. He didn't push. He walked into the room, sat on the opposite end of the sofa, and waited. The space between them felt deliberate, close enough to matter, far enough to be safe. Minutes passed, the clock ticked, the tea cooled in her hands. "I'm an orphan," she said. The word came out smaller than she intended. She hadn't planned to say it, hadn't planned to say anything. But the quiet had loosened something, and the word slipped through the crack before she could close it. She kept her eyes on the fireplace. "I was in care from the time I was 3. I don't remember my parents. I had foster families, some good, some just fine, none that lasted." I aged out of the system at 18 with a suitcase that wasn't much better than the one I brought here. She paused, took a breath. The tea was warm against her palms. I've never told anyone this. Not even Sophie knows all of it. A small, sad smile. I always wanted a family. Not in the way people say it when they mean eventually someday. I mean, I wanted it the way you want oxygen. Every day, every minute, for as long as I can remember. She glanced at him then. His face was still, not blank, still. The way a lake is still when the wind drops and everything underneath goes quiet. Watching you with the boys today, she said, and her voice wavered for just a second. That's everything I ever wanted. And it's not mine. The silence that followed was heavy and tender at the same time. The clock ticked. A bird called somewhere outside, distant and fading. Tristan didn't speak. He didn't offer words of comfort or reassurance, or any of the things people usually say when they don't know what to do with someone else's sadness. He reached across the space between them. His hand, open and steady, settled over hers where it rested on the cushion. His fingers were warm. His grip was firm, not tight, just present. The calluses on his palm pressed against her skin, and the roughness of them felt more honest than anything he'd ever said to her. She looked down at their hands, then up at him. His eyes were dark in the low light, steady, holding hers without flinching, without looking away, without the careful distance he usually kept like a wall between them. They stayed like that. Neither moved, neither spoke. And then, slowly, they both smiled. Small, sincere. The kind of smile that doesn't need an audience. The clock kept ticking. The tea went cold. Outside, the Cotswolds night settled over the hills like a blanket being pulled up gently. And for the first time since she'd arrived at the manor, Ava didn't feel like a guest. She felt like someone who'd been found. The doorbell rang on a Thursday afternoon, and everything that had been quietly building between them detonated. Ava was in the kitchen, barefoot, sleeves rolled up, helping Oliver assemble what he called a masterpiece, and what was, in reality, a lopsided tower of cardboard and tape. Ethan was on the floor drawing a dragon with 6 legs, deeply committed to his artistic vision. Mrs. Finch had gone to the village for shopping. Tristan was at the office. The bell rang again. Ava wiped her hands on a towel and went to the door. The man on the other side was young, late 20s maybe, with sandy brown hair that fell across his forehead and a smile that arrived before he did. He wore a linen shirt with the collar open and carried a rolled-up set of blueprints under one arm. "Hi," he said. "I'm Daniel Webb, from Oakley and Hale. I've got revised plans for the Cheltenham project. Tristan asked me to drop them off." "He's not here," Ava said, "but you can leave them with me." She stepped back to let him in. He walked into the entrance hall, looked around with the appreciation of someone who understood buildings, and let out a low whistle. "Every time I come here, this place gets me. The stonework on the east wing is original, did you know that? 18th century. You can tell by the way the mortar sits." He talked the way some people breathe, easily, naturally, without effort. Within 2 minutes, he'd complimented the garden, asked about the boys, and made her laugh with a story about a client who demanded a swimming pool shaped like a guitar. Ava laughed. Not because she was flirting. She wasn't, not even close. But because Daniel was funny and easy, and she'd spent the last several weeks in a house where every conversation felt loaded with things neither she nor Tristan could say. It felt nice to just talk. Oliver wandered into the hall curious. Daniel crouched down, admired the cardboard tower, and suggested adding a drawbridge. Oliver's eyes lit up. Within minutes, the two were on the floor debating structural integrity with the seriousness of a board meeting. That was when Tristan walked in. Ava heard the front door before she saw him. The sound of his shoes on the stone floor was sharp, deliberate. She turned and found him standing at the edge of the hallway, briefcase in hand, coat still on. His eyes moved from Daniel, crouched beside his son on the floor, to Ava, standing close, smiling, her cheeks still flushed from laughing. His face closed like a steel door. "Daniel," he said. The name came out flat, stripped of any warmth. Daniel stood, easy as ever. "Afternoon, just dropping off the Cheltenham revisions. Your fiancé was kind enough to let me in." Tristan took the blueprints without looking at them. You could have left them at the office. You said you wanted them today. At the office, Daniel. The temperature in the hallway dropped 10 degrees. Daniel, to his credit, read the room. He nodded, said goodbye to Ava and Oliver, and was out the door in under a minute. His car crunched down the gravel and disappeared through the gates. Silence. Oliver took his cardboard tower and retreated to the kitchen. 6-year-olds had excellent instincts for atmospheric danger. Tristan set the blueprints on the hall table, removed his coat, hung it on the hook with precise, controlled movements. Each gesture was deliberate, mechanical, like a man reassembling his composure piece by piece. He seemed comfortable, Tristan said. Ava frowned. He was dropping off plans. That's literally his job. His job doesn't require sitting on my floor making my son laugh. He was being friendly. It's something people do. Tristan turned to face her. His jaw was tight. The muscle below his ear pulsed in a steady rhythm. His dark eyes were hard, but underneath the hardness, there was something else. Something raw and uncontrolled that he was trying very hard to bury. "You're supposed to be engaged," he said. "To me, that's the arrangement." Ava stared at him. The words hit her like a slap, not because they were cruel, but because of what they revealed. "I was being polite," she said, her voice dropping low and steady. "I opened the door, I let him in, he told a funny story, and I laughed. That is not flirting, Tristan. That is being a normal human being." "You were—" "I was what? Go on. Finish the sentence." He didn't. His mouth opened and closed, and she watched him fight with something that had no place in a contract or a plan or a spreadsheet. His hands were at his sides, fingers curling and releasing. "You need to be more careful," he said finally. "In public, in this house, at the door. There's a custody case, people talk." "Oh, that's what this is about." "The case." She stepped closer. Her pulse was hammering. "Because it doesn't sound like the case, Tristan. It sounds like jealousy." His jaw clenched. "That's ridiculous." "Is it? Because the man who doesn't want anything real, the man who hired me to play a part, just stormed into his own house and kicked out an employee for making me laugh." "I didn't kick him out. You froze him out. Same thing, different temperature." They were close now. Close enough that she could see the vein in his neck pulsing, could smell the cold outside air still clinging to his coat, could feel the heat radiating off him despite the rigid control in every line of his body. "You have rules," she said, her voice rising. "You have your contract and your neat little boxes and your separate bedrooms, and now you're standing here acting like I did something wrong because another man was kind to me. You don't get to do that. Not when you won't even admit what you feel. You don't know what I feel. Then tell me. For once in your life, say something that isn't a clause in an agreement." The silence between them was a living thing, hot, electric, pressing against them from all sides. Tristan's voice was tight. "You need to be more aware of the impression you give." Something inside her snapped, not broke. Snapped, sharp and clean, like a rubber band stretched too far. "The impression I give?" she repeated. "I have not looked at another man since I walked through that door. Not once. Not Daniel, not anyone at that party. Not a single person in this village or this county or this entire country. I only have eyes for you, Tristan. You, the impossible, stubborn, infuriating man who won't let himself feel anything that wasn't on his schedule." The words filled the hallway. She hadn't meant to say them, not like that, not all at once. But they were out now, hanging in the air between them like a confession that had been building since the night in the corridor, since the morning of the pancakes, since the moment she'd watched him throw his son in the air and felt her whole heart rearrange itself. Tristan didn't move. His eyes were locked on hers, wide, dark, stripped of every layer of control he usually wore. For the first time since she'd met him, he looked completely undone. The hallway was silent. The afternoon light slanted through the window, catching dust motes that floated between them like the smallest possible witnesses. Ava swallowed. Her cheeks were burning. Her hands were shaking. She moved to walk past him, to escape, to her room, to the garden, anywhere that wasn't 2 feet from a man she'd just opened herself up to like a cracked safe. His hand caught her arm. She stopped. His grip was firm, not rough, just certain. The way he held everything, with intention, with control, with the quiet authority of a man who knew exactly what he wanted, even when he'd spent weeks pretending he didn't. He pulled her back. She turned. His other hand found her waist and pressed her against the wall. The stone was cool against her back. His body was warm against her front. His face was inches from hers, and his breathing was ragged, and his eyes, his dark, careful, infuriating eyes, were looking at her like she was the only real thing in a house full of pretend. He didn't ask permission with words. He asked with the pause, the half-second where his gaze dropped to her mouth and his thumb pressed against her hip, and every muscle in his body coiled with the effort of waiting. She didn't answer with words either. She answered by not pulling away. He kissed her. His mouth met hers and the world went quiet. Not gentle, not at first. The kiss landed with the force of everything they'd been holding back. His hand slid into her hair, fingers tangling at the base of her neck, tilting her head back. His other hand gripped her waist and pulled her against him until there was no space left between them. The wall was solid and cold behind her. He was solid and warm in front of her. And between the two, Ava stopped thinking. He tasted like coffee and something darker, something that made her fingers curl into the fabric of his shirt. His lips were firm, insistent, and when they parted against hers, the sound she made was small and involuntary and completely beyond her control. He kissed her like a man who had been solving equations his entire life and had finally encountered something that couldn't be solved. Like he was angry about it. Like he was grateful for it. Like he wanted to consume the problem entirely and let it consume him back. Her hands moved up his chest, feeling the heat of him through the cotton, the hard lines underneath, and found the back of his neck. Her fingers slid into his hair. He made a low sound against her mouth, half breath, half something else, and the kiss deepened. His tongue brushed hers and her spine arched off the wall. Time dissolved. She didn't know if it lasted seconds or minutes. All she knew was the pressure of his mouth, the grip of his hands, the way his breathing matched hers, rough, unsteady, starving. When they finally broke apart, neither moved away. His forehead rested against hers. His chest rose and fell in heavy rhythm. She could feel his heartbeat through his shirt, fast and hard, betraying every ounce of control he'd ever claimed to have. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, like gravel under water. Stay. One word. She waited, not because of the contract, not for the case. He pulled back just enough to look at her. His eyes were dark, open, unguarded in a way she'd never seen. I want you to stay because I can't do this anymore. I can't pretend you're pretend. Ava's breath caught. Her fingers were still in his hair. Her back was still against the wall. The hallway was still silent. Tristan, I know what I said. I know the rules. I wrote them. His thumb traced a line along her jaw. And I've been breaking every single one in my head since the night you walked past me in that corridor. She looked at him. The man who planned everything, who controlled everything, who filed his emotions in drawers that never mixed. And here he was, undone, unscripted, asking her to stay with a voice that shook at the edges. She didn't answer with words. She pulled him back to her and kissed him again, softer this time, slower, a kiss that said yes in a language they were only just learning together. That evening moved in a kind of haze. They cooked dinner side by side, his shoulder brushing hers at the stove, her hand resting on his back as she reached for the salt. The boys noticed nothing, or perhaps everything, chattering about school and dragons and whether frogs could swim backwards. Normal sounds. Ordinary sounds. But the air between Tristan and Ava hummed with something new, something that made every accidental touch feel deliberate and every look last a beat too long. She read the boys their bedtime story. Oliver chose pirates again. Ethan chose a new one about a bear who couldn't find his way home. She did the voices, got the bear's grumble just right, and both boys were asleep before the last page. She closed the door softly, stepped into the hallway. He was there, leaning against the wall across from the boys' room, arms at his sides, waiting. The hallway was dim, just the warm glow from the lamp at the far end, the same hallway where they'd collided weeks ago, breathless and pretending. No one was pretending now. He extended his hand, Open. Steady. Palm up. She looked at it. Then at him. His face was calm, but his eyes held something bright and fragile underneath, a question he wouldn't ask twice. She took his hand. His fingers closed around hers. Warm. Certain. He led her down the hall, past her bedroom door, closed untouched to his. He opened it, stepped inside, and she followed. The room smelled like him. Clean linen, wood, the faint trace of soap that she'd been catching in corridors and doorways for weeks. A lamp on the nightstand cast a low amber light. The bed was wide, the sheets dark. Everything was ordered, precise, exactly what she'd expected from a man who kept his life in straight lines. He closed the door. The click of the latch was soft, final, like the last word of a long argument. They stood facing each other, close. The air between them felt thick and tender. He raised his hand and brushed the hair from her face. His fingers moved slowly, tracing the line of her temple, tucking the strand behind her ear. The gesture was so gentle, so at odds with the man who gave orders and closed deals and stared down courtrooms, that her breath caught in her throat. "Are you sure?" he asked. His voice was barely above a whisper. She answered by reaching up and pulling him to her by the back of his neck. The kiss began slow, careful. His hands found her waist, then the hem of her shirt, and his fingertips grazed the bare skin underneath with a tenderness that made her shiver. She could feel the restraint in him, the effort it cost to be gentle when every line of his body was taut with wanting. She pulled back just enough to look at him. His eyes were dark and focused entirely on her, as though she was the only thing in the room, the only thing in the house, the only thing in any plan he'd ever made that actually mattered. She kissed the corner of his mouth, then his jaw, then the place where his pulse beat hard beneath his ear. His control broke, not all at once, but in stages, like ice cracking in spring. His arms tightened around her. His mouth found her neck, her collarbone, the curve of her shoulder. Every touch was slow, devoted, as if he were learning her by heart with his hands and his lips. They moved together with the patience of people who had waited too long to rush. And when there was nothing left between them, no contracts, no walls, no pretending, he held her like she was the answer to a question he'd stopped believing he'd ever ask. Later, in the dark, she lay against his chest. His arm was around her, his thumb drawing absent circles on her shoulder. The room was quiet. The house was quiet. The world outside had stopped mattering hours ago. "Your room's going to get dusty," he murmured against her hair. She smiled into his skin. "Mrs. Finch will have opinions." "Mrs. Finch always has opinions." She pressed closer. His arm tightened. And for the first time in her life, Ava fell asleep knowing exactly where she belonged. Ethan figured it out first. It was breakfast, the morning after. Ava came downstairs wearing one of Tristan's jumpers, too big in the shoulders, sleeves hanging past her wrists, because she'd grabbed the first thing within reach and hadn't thought about what it would signal. Tristan was already at the table, coffee in hand, and when she appeared in the doorway wearing his clothes, his cup paused halfway to his mouth. A slow, private smile crossed his face before he could stop it. Ethan looked at her, looked at his father, looked at the jumper, then looked at Oliver with the unmistakable expression of a child who had just solved a very important puzzle. "Dad," Ethan said carefully, "is Ava your girlfriend now? Like, for real?" The kitchen went still. Mrs. Finch, who had been wiping the counter with her back turned, stopped moving but didn't turn around. Tristan set down his cup. He glanced at Ava. She glanced back. Neither of them had discussed what to say. Neither of them had planned this moment, because the man who planned everything had for once been too busy living to schedule the conversation. "Yes," Tristan said simply. Oliver dropped his spoon into his cereal with a splash. "Does that mean she's staying? Staying. If she wants to." Both boys turned to Ava, with eyes so wide and hopeful that her chest ached. "I'm staying," she said. What followed was chaos. Ethan knocked over his juice, reaching across the table to hug her. Oliver abandoned his chair entirely, ran around the table and attached himself to her leg like a small determined anchor. Ava laughed, a real laugh, surprised and full, and gathered both boys against her, one on each side, their small arms tight around her waist. Over their heads she met Tristan's eyes. He was watching the three of them with an expression she'd never seen on him before, not controlled, not guarded, just full, like a man looking at something he hadn't dared to want. Mrs. Finch turned around. Her face was composed, unreadable. She picked up Ethan's juice glass, wiped the spill with a cloth, and set a fresh glass in front of him. "I'll make extra for dinner tonight then," she said. Nothing more. But as she passed behind Ava's chair on the way to the sink, her hand brushed Ava's shoulder. Light. Brief. So quick it might have been accidental. It wasn't. The days that followed had a different texture. The house itself seemed to breathe differently, as if the walls had been holding something tight and had finally let go. The boys stopped competing for space beside Ava on the sofa, because she was always there now, every evening, with Oliver on one side and Ethan on the other, and Tristan at the far end, pretending to read while his foot rested against hers under the blanket. Small things changed. Tristan started leaving his office door open when he worked from home. Ava found her toothbrush in his bathroom one morning and realized she hadn't put it there. He had. Mrs. Finch began setting 4 places at the table without being asked, and one afternoon she left a vase of fresh flowers in Ava's old room, which was now used for nothing but storage, and a growing collection of the twins' art projects. Ava noticed. She noticed everything, because for someone who had never belonged anywhere, every sign of permanence felt like a gift she needed to memorize before it disappeared. It didn't disappear. One evening, midweek, the boys went to bed early. Oliver had worn himself out building a fort in the garden, and Ethan had fallen asleep during his story, mouth open, one hand still clutching Professor Trunk. Ava came downstairs to find Tristan in the sitting room. He'd opened a bottle of wine, something red and good, the kind she'd never have bought for herself, and 2 glasses sat on the low table, lit by the warm glow of the lamp. Music played softly from somewhere she couldn't see, something with a piano and no words. She sat beside him. He poured. Their fingers touched on the glass and stayed. The conversation drifted. They talked about the boys, Oliver's sudden obsession with maps, Ethan's conviction that he could teach the garden cat to sit. They talked about the firm, about a project Tristan was finishing in Cheltenham. She told him about the time she'd tried to cook a Christmas dinner for herself at 19 and set off the fire alarm in the communal kitchen. He laughed, really laughed, the sound low and warm and close. She told him about Gerald, the succulent on her windowsill in Salford, and how she'd talked to it on bad days because there was no one else. "You have people now," he said quietly. "I know." She pressed her shoulder against his. "Still might talk to Gerald, though. He's a good listener." He smiled, the kind that reached his eyes and softened everything about him. The wine went down slowly. The conversation slowed with it, words giving way to comfortable silence, silence giving way to proximity. His hand rested on her thigh. Her head leaned against his shoulder. The room was warm, the light was low, and the piano played its quiet, steady melody. Then, without warning, he set his glass down, stood and scooped her off the sofa. She yelped. "Tristan, hold the wine." "What?" He grabbed both glasses, handed them to her, and carried her through the hall and up the stairs as if she weighed nothing. She held the glasses out to the sides, red wine swaying dangerously, laughing in a way that made her whole body shake. "If I spill this on your shirt, it's my shirt. I'll survive." He carried her into the master suite and through to the bathroom. It was large, tiled in pale stone, with a deep freestanding tub beneath a window that looked out onto the dark garden. He set her down, turned the taps, and the room began to fill with the sound of running water and rising steam. He took the glasses from her hands, set them on the wide edge of the tub. Then, with the same steady deliberation he brought to everything, he turned to her and began unbuttoning her shirt. His shirt, technically, one button at a time. She reached for his. They undressed each other slowly, without urgency, with the ease of 2 people who had already crossed every threshold that mattered. His hands traced the line of her shoulders as the fabric fell. Her fingers spread across his chest, feeling the warmth of him, the rise and fall of his breathing. They stepped into the water together, hot, deep, enveloping. She settled against him, her back against his chest, his arms around her waist. The wine glasses sat within reach, steam curled around them. They talked, about nothing important, a film he wanted to see, a recipe she wanted to try, whether the boys would ever agree on a bedtime. He told her about the first house he'd ever built, a small cottage in the Cotswolds that leaked every time it rained. She told him she'd once applied for a job as a dog walker and been rejected because she sneezed during the interview. He laughed against her neck. She felt the vibration of it in her spine. The conversation thinned. His lips found her shoulder. Her head tilted back. The water lapped quietly at the edges of the tub. They stopped talking. The wine sat forgotten, and the night folded softly around them, warm and unhurried, and entirely their own. The letter arrived on a Monday morning, tucked inside a crisp white envelope with a solicitor's address printed in the corner. Mrs. Finch brought it in with the post and set it on the kitchen table beside Tristan's coffee without comment. She didn't need to. She recognized legal stationery the way some people recognized storm clouds. Tristan opened it while Ava was upstairs getting the boys dressed. He read it once, then again. His jaw tightened. The color in his face shifted. Not pale exactly, but drained, like someone had turned down a dial behind his skin. By the time Ava came downstairs with Oliver and Ethan in tow, the letter was gone. Folded. Tucked into his jacket pocket. His coffee sat untouched. He kissed the boys on the head, told Ava he had an early meeting, and left the house before she could ask why his eyes looked different. She found out that evening. He told her in the study, door closed, voice flat. The maternal grandparents had filed a new motion. They were alleging the engagement was fraudulent, a fabrication designed to influence the court. They had hired a private investigator. They were requesting additional social worker visits and an expedited hearing. Ava sat in the leather chair and felt the room tilt. How do they know? She asked. They don't know. They suspect. But suspicion, with enough money behind it, can do plenty of damage. His tone was measured, controlled. The same voice he used in meetings, the one she'd heard through walls when he was on calls with contractors. Professional, detached. As if the thing crumbling wasn't his family, but a project running over budget. She reached for his hand. He pulled it back. Not sharply, just enough. A small retreat that landed like a door closing between them. Tristan. I need to think. I need to call the solicitor. I need to sort this out. We can sort it out together. This isn't your fight. The words hung in the air. She stared at him. He stared at the desk. Not my fight, she repeated quietly. I live here. I sleep in your bed. Your children call me by my name and fight over who sits beside me at breakfast. And it's not my fight? He didn't answer. His jaw worked. The muscle beneath his ear pulsed. She stood, walked to the door, stopped with her hand on the handle. I've seen this before, she said, and her voice was steady but thin like a wire pulled taut. This is what people do when they're scared. They push away the person standing closest so the fall hurts less. I grew up watching people do it. Foster parents, social workers, people who were supposed to stay. She turned to face him. His eyes were dark, guarded, and somewhere underneath the guard, she could see what he was trying to hide. Fear. Raw, parental, bone-deep fear of losing his sons. I'm not going anywhere, she said, but I need you to stop treating me like I'm temporary. I need you to trust me the way you trust your boys, because if you shut me out every time something gets hard, then the grandparents don't need a court to separate us. You'll do it yourself. She left, closed the door behind her, walked down the hallway with her hands shaking and her chest tight and every old wound she carried singing in unison. Tristan sat alone in the study for a long time. The desk lamp cast sharp shadows. His phone sat silent beside the folded letter. Outside the garden was dark. He thought about his boys, about the hearing, about the grandparents who had never forgiven him for not being enough. Not enough of a husband, not enough of a father, not enough of whatever imaginary man they thought their daughter deserved. And then he thought about Ava, about the way she'd said, I'm not going anywhere, not as a promise wrapped in sweetness, but as a fact delivered with the same steady fire she'd brought to every moment since she'd stepped out of that car with a broken suitcase and told him she expected someone friendlier. She wasn't temporary. She'd never been temporary. And the fact that he'd treated her that way, even for a moment, even out of fear, settled in his chest like a stone he'd swallowed. 2 days passed. They moved around each other carefully, polite, gentle, wounded. The boys felt it. Oliver grew quiet at meals. Ethan started sleeping with Professor Trunk again, tucked tight against his chest. On the second night, Tristan found Ava in the kitchen. Late. The house was dark. She stood at the counter with a mug of tea she wasn't drinking, staring out the window at nothing. He stood in the doorway. She didn't turn around. "You're right," he said. She didn't move. "My boys are the most precious thing I have, and the idea of losing them makes me shut down. I close everything off. I go to a place where I think I can handle it alone, because alone is the only way I've ever known how to survive." He took a step closer. His voice dropped. "But I don't want to survive alone anymore, and I don't want you to feel like you're standing outside a door I keep closing." He paused. "I'm sorry, Ava." She turned. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry. She looked at him for a long moment, reading him, weighing him, deciding something with the careful instinct of a woman who'd learned the hard way that words and actions weren't always the same thing. Then she set the mug down, crossed the kitchen, and pressed her forehead against his chest. His arms came around her. He held on tight, his chin resting on her head, his breath unsteady. "Don't do that again," she whispered. "I won't." They stood in the dark kitchen holding each other, while the old house settled around them and the court date drew closer. Rain fell on the courthouse steps like it had a personal grudge against the morning. Ava stood beside Tristan under a black umbrella, both of them in dark clothes, both of them silent. His solicitor, a compact, sharp-eyed woman named Catherine Price, walked ahead, heels clicking on wet stone, briefcase held like a weapon. Inside, the courthouse smelled like floor polish and tension. Long corridors, fluorescent lights, the hum of a building designed to hold the worst days of people's lives between its beige walls. The courtroom was smaller than Ava expected, wood-paneled, formal, with a raised bench for the judge and rows of chairs that felt too close together. The grandparents were already seated on the opposite side. Margaret and Harold Whitfield, grey-haired, well-dressed, sitting with the rigid posture of people who believed correctness was the same as love. Their solicitor, a tall man with silver cufflinks, arranged papers with practiced calm. Tristan sat in the front row. Ava sat beside him. His hand found hers under the table. His grip was tight. She squeezed back. The hearing began. Catherine spoke first. Clear, precise, building the picture one brick at a time. She presented reports from the social worker, 3 visits over 6 months, each one documenting a stable, loving home. The boys were healthy, thriving, well-adjusted. Their school records showed improvement. Their emotional well-being had been assessed and found strong. She presented testimony from Mrs. Finch, given in a written statement that read like a woman who chose every word the way she chose every ingredient, carefully and with no tolerance for waste. "The children are happy," it said. "The house is a home. I have worked for this family for 9 years, and I have never seen those boys more settled than they are now." She presented testimony from James Hale, from the boys' teacher, from the village doctor who'd known the family since the twins were born. And then it was the other side's turn. The grandparents' solicitor was smooth. He painted a different picture. A single father with a demanding career, a sudden engagement to a woman with no verifiable history, a household arrangement that appeared from the outside convenient rather than genuine. He questioned the timeline. He questioned Ava's background. He questioned whether the relationship was real or constructed specifically for the benefit of the court. Ava sat still. Her face was calm. Inside, every nerve was burning. Tristan's hand hadn't let go of hers. His thumb pressed against her knuckle in a slow, steady rhythm, the only sign that the man beside her was holding himself together with force of will. The judge, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses perched on her nose and eyes that missed nothing, listened to everything. She asked questions, sharp ones, direct. She asked Tristan how the boys had adjusted after their mother's death. He answered honestly. The first year had been difficult. Oliver had nightmares. Ethan had stopped talking for 2 months. They'd seen a therapist. He'd rearranged his entire work schedule to be present. He'd made mistakes. He'd learned. She asked about Ava, how they'd met, how the relationship had developed. Tristan looked at the judge, and for the first time all morning, his voice softened. "She came into our lives at a time when I wasn't looking for anyone. I wasn't ready. I thought I could manage everything on my own. She proved me wrong, not by trying to, but by being herself. My sons love her, not because anyone told them to, but because she earned it, every single day. Ava's throat tightened. She stared straight ahead because if she looked at him, she would fall apart in a courtroom, and she refused to give anyone that. The judge asked Margaret Whitfield why she believed the children would be better in her care. Margaret spoke with measured grief about her daughter, about the boys, about her fear that they were being raised without a mother's touch. The judge nodded, made notes. The room waited. The recess lasted 40 minutes. Ava and Tristan sat on a bench in the corridor. Neither spoke. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened and closed. Ava leaned her head against his shoulder. He pressed his lips to her hair. Brief, firm, like a man bracing for impact. When they returned to the courtroom, the judge was already seated. The room fell silent. She spoke carefully. She acknowledged the grandparents' love for their grandchildren. She acknowledged their grief. She said that the loss of a child was something no parent should endure, and that their desire to be part of the boys' lives was understandable and honorable. Then she turned to the matter at hand. The evidence, she said, was clear. The children were in a stable, loving environment. The father had demonstrated consistent, devoted care. The household was supportive. The reports from every professional involved confirmed that the boys were not only safe, but thriving. She ruled in favor of the father. Full custody remained with Tristan Oakley. The grandparents were granted visitation rights, structured, regular, generous, but the application for custody was denied. Margaret Whitfield's hand rose to her mouth. Harold placed his palm on her back. Their solicitor leaned in to speak quietly. Tristan didn't move, not at first. He sat completely still, eyes forward, jaw locked, as if the news hadn't landed yet. His hand was still holding Ava's, and she felt the moment it hit him. A tremor, small and involuntary, running through his fingers like a current finally released. They walked out of the courthouse in silence, down the corridor, through the heavy doors, into the grey car park where the rain had eased to a fine mist. He stopped walking. So did she. He turned to face her. His eyes were bright, glassy, and the rigid composure he'd worn all morning was cracking at every edge. He pulled her to him, both arms, tight. The kind of embrace that says everything words can't. Relief, gratitude, love. The terrified exhale of a man who had just fought for the only thing that mattered and won. She held him back, her arms around his neck, her face pressed against his collar, breathing him in, rain and wool and the warmth underneath. He pulled back just enough to look at her, cupped her face in both hands, and kissed her, right there in the car park, with the courthouse behind them and the mist on their skin, and the whole world watching or no one watching at all. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered, except this. 3 weeks after the hearing, the manor settled into something it hadn't been in years. Quiet. Not the stiff, held-breath quiet of a house waiting for bad news. The other kind. The kind that comes when the storm has passed and people stop bracing. Oliver started leaving his drawings on the kitchen table for Ava to find in the morning. Stick figures, 4 of them, always 4, holding hands in front of a house with a crooked chimney and a garden full of circles that were meant to be flowers. He never said anything about them, just left them there, like small, silent declarations. Ethan had taken to reading aloud to her at bedtime, stumbling over words proud and determined, instead of the other way around. Ava would sit beside him, following along with her finger, correcting gently when he got stuck, and feeling something warm bloom in her chest every time he looked up at her for approval. Mrs. Finch had started calling her by her first name, not often, just once or twice in passing, as if testing how it sounded in her own mouth. It sounded like acceptance. And Tristan. Tristan had changed in ways she could feel more than see. The tension he carried in his shoulders had loosened. He laughed more easily. He reached for her hand without thinking, in the car, at the table, in the hallway between their room and the boys' room. Small gestures repeated daily that told her everything his words sometimes still stumbled over. One Saturday evening, after a long day in the garden with the boys, mud on everyone's knees, grass in everyone's hair, they put the twins to bed together. Oliver was asleep before the second page. Ethan fought it until the fourth, then surrendered with Professor Trunk clutched to his chest. Ava went to shower. When she came out, wrapped in a towel with her hair still damp, Tristan was sitting on the edge of their bed. He wore a dark shirt, sleeves rolled, and he was holding a sheet of paper. His face had that particular tension she'd learned to recognize, the one that meant he'd been thinking about something for a long time and had finally decided to say it. "Sit down," he said. She sat beside him. Water dripped from her hair onto her shoulder. He watched the droplets slide along her collarbone, then blinked and looked at the paper. "I've drafted new terms," he said. She frowned. "Terms?" He held up the paper. At the top, in his precise handwriting, it read, "Revised Contract, Final Version." Her breath caught. He began to read. Clause 1. She will sleep on the left side of the bed because she kicks in her sleep, and the left side is farther from the nightstand I keep hitting. She laughed. A short, startled sound. Clause 2. She will accept kisses without prior notice at any time in any room, including but not limited to the kitchen, the garden, the hallway, and the cereal aisle of the village shop. Her eyes were stinging now. She pressed her lips together. Clause 3. She will allow the twins to call her whatever they choose whenever they're ready, without correction or hesitation. A tear slipped down her cheek. She didn't wipe it. Clause 4. She will remain in this house, in this family, in this life, for as long as she wants, which, if the undersigned has any say in the matter, will be forever. He lowered the paper, looked at her. His dark eyes were steady but bright, and the composure he wore like armor had a crack running straight through the center. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Dark blue, worn at the edges, old in a way that said it had been waiting for this moment, longer than either of them had been alive. He opened it. Inside was a ring. Not flashy, not enormous. A single stone set in a thin gold band, elegant and warm. The kind of ring that looked like it had a story. "It was my mother's," he said. His voice was rough. "She gave it to me before she passed. Told me to give it to someone who made the house feel like a home." Ava looked at the ring, then at him, then at the paper still in his hand, the handwriting she'd come to recognize on grocery lists and notes left on the kitchen counter, and the margins of blueprints she found on his desk. "You planned this," she whispered. "I plan everything." A pause. The corner of his mouth twitched. "You're the only thing I never saw coming." She laughed through the tears. The sound was messy and real and exactly right. He took the ring from the box, held it between his fingers, waited. "All clauses," she said. "Every single one." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit like it had been made for her hand, warm from the velvet, catching the lamplight. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at him, the man who had hired her from a newspaper ad, who had handed her a contract with separate bedrooms, who had fought her and frustrated her and held her hand in a courtroom and carried her up the stairs with wine glasses swaying. She cupped his face in both hands and kissed him, slow, deep, tasting of salt from her tears and something sweeter underneath. His arms came around her, pulling her close, and the paper crumpled between them, and neither of them cared. When they broke apart, his forehead rested against hers. "Best hire I ever made," he murmured. She laughed against his mouth. "Wait until you see the performance review." The garden had never looked like this before. White chairs lined the lawn in two neat rows, facing an arch woven with ivy and pale roses that Mrs. Finch had cut from the east wall that morning with the focus of a woman on a mission. Lanterns hung from the low branches of the oak tree at the edge of the property, their glass clean and gleaming, waiting for the evening light. A long table stretched beneath a linen canopy, set with wildflowers in mismatched jars that Ava had insisted on, because perfection, she said, was boring, and this family had never been boring for a single day. The morning was bright and cool, the sky over the Cotswolds a clean, washed blue that looked like it had been ordered for the occasion. Inside the manor, chaos reigned. Oliver had lost one of the rings. Ethan had found it inside Professor Trunk's missing ear, which raised more questions than it answered. James was in the hallway adjusting his navy tie for the 7th time, grinning at anyone who passed. Sophie had arrived the night before, taken one look at Tristan, turned to Ava, and mouthed the words, "You were right. It's worse than you described. He's absurdly handsome." Ava had thrown a cushion at her. "Mrs." Finch moved through the house like a general before battle, checking flowers, straightening chairs, inspecting the caterer's work with narrowed eyes, and a single devastating nod of approval. Ava stood in the bedroom, their bedroom, in front of the full-length mirror. Her dress was simple. Ivory fitted at the waist with thin straps and a low back that Sophie had chosen because, in her words, if you've got it, the man should see it on the day he promises forever. Her hair was down, loose waves over her shoulders, and the only jewelry she wore was the gold ring already on her finger and a pair of small earrings Sophie had lent her. She looked at herself. Really looked. The woman in the mirror had arrived at this house with a broken suitcase and no one in the world to call. She'd been angry, proud, terrified, and too stubborn to admit any of it. She'd slept in a borrowed room and woken every morning braced for the moment someone would tell her it was time to go. No one had. Sophie appeared behind her in the mirror. She wore a soft green dress and an expression that was trying very hard not to cry. "You look incredible," Sophie said, "and if you make me ruin my makeup before the ceremony, I will never forgive you." Ava laughed, took a breath, pressed her hand against her stomach, not from nerves but from something fuller, something she'd tell him about later, when the guests were gone and the house was quiet. The ceremony was small. Family, close friends, the boy's teacher, a few colleagues from the firm. The kind of wedding where everyone knew everyone and the laughter started before the vows. The twins walked down the aisle together, each carrying a cushion with a ring, moving with the exaggerated seriousness of children who understood the importance of their mission. Oliver kept his eyes straight ahead. Ethan waved at Mrs. Finch as he passed, and she pressed a handkerchief to her mouth and looked away. Tristan stood at the arch, dark suit, white shirt, no tie, because Ava had told him once that he looked best when he wasn't trying, and he'd remembered. James stood beside him, hands behind his back, smiling like a man who'd seen this coming before anyone else. When Ava appeared at the end of the aisle, Tristan's face did something she'd never seen. Every wall, every line of control, every carefully maintained edge, all of it fell away in a single breath. His eyes went bright, his lips parted, his chest rose and held. She walked toward him on steady legs, bouquet in hand, heart so full it ached. He took her hand when she reached him. His grip was firm, warm, shaking just slightly at the edges. "Hi," she whispered. "Hi." His voice cracked on the word. James handed him a tissue without looking. Tristan ignored it. The vows were short, honest. He promised to leave the left side of the bed. She promised to stop stealing his jumpers, then immediately took it back. The guests laughed. The boys cheered. Mrs. Finch did not cry. She would deny it until her last day, and everyone would let her. They kissed under the ivy arch, and the garden filled with applause, and somewhere inside the manor, the kettle Mrs. Finch had left on began to whistle, which made everyone laugh again. The evening was warm. Lanterns glowed. The boys fell asleep in their chairs after cake, and had to be carried upstairs by James and Sophie, who argued softly about the correct way to hold a sleeping child. Later, much later, the house was still. Ava sat on the veranda in the soft, dark, bare feet on the cool stone, a blanket around her shoulders. The garden stretched before her, chairs still out, lanterns still flickering, the last traces of the day hanging in the air like a song that hadn't quite ended. Tristan came out with the morning paper, early edition delivered to the gate. He sat beside her and unfolded it to a page near the back. A small section had been circled in red ink. She looked closer. The ad. The same ad. The same small print, same phrasing. Position available, generous compensation. Discretion required. He'd had it reprinted. A copy, identical to the one she'd torn from the paper in her tiny flat in Salford a lifetime ago. Beneath it, in his handwriting, 4 words. Best hire of my life. She laughed, pressed her face into his shoulder, breathed him in. Soap, linen, the garden at night. "I need to tell you something," she said. He looked at her, waiting. She took his hand and pressed it flat against her stomach. His eyes widened, his mouth opened. No sound came out. Clause 5, she said softly. From inside the kitchen, a crash. Then Ethan's voice, high and guilty. The milk fell again. Tristan laughed. Ava laughed. The sound carried across the garden over the stone walls into the Cotswolds night. The manor, for the first time in its long history, sounded exactly like a home. End of narrative. Leave your comment and share this story with someone special. It truly helps us keep bringing new stories to you. And if you want to follow every chapter of this emotional journey, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Your support makes all the difference.